Let's continue our series on the resurrection. So today we're going to be talking about one of the strongest points, really, of that points towards Jesus's resurrection. And it's the fact that the disciples, they genuinely believed that he had risen from the dead. So much so that they were willing to suffer and die for this belief. And this point is accepted by the vast majority of scholars out there, even from non-Christians. So we need to start with what happened right after the crucifixion. If you know the story, the disciples, they were not brave heroes. That's written multiple times through various, tellings in the New Testament. Right after their leader was crucified, they were scared. They were running. They went back to some in hiding. They went back to their old lives. Their leader had been publicly executed, and they thought that meant an end to all the movement that they had just, been working towards the past 3 years. It was over for them. And that's exactly what we would expect if Jesus had stayed dead. But then something very dramatic happened. Very shortly after the crucifixion, you see them out publicly proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead and that they had seen it with their own eyes. People will die for something that they're mistakenly thinking is true, but they're not going to die for something that they know is a lie. It's a very important distinction here. So if the disciples had stolen the body or were lying, made up the story, which many people, tout, they would have known it. And then torture and death, that would have ended that story immediately. But that's not what happened. We see very early eyewitness testimony that confirms this belief. Paul records this in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about the creed that he passes on that dates within just a few years of the crucifixion. He named eyewitnesses and appearances that could have been verified at that time that they saw Jesus Christ, the risen Jesus Christ. And that's way too early by anyone's standards for legend or myth to creep in. A few years? That usually takes multiple generations for myth or legend to creep in. No, this is immediate belief. So historians, they ask this simple question of what best explains the sudden transformation of the disciples from these frightened individuals, these frightened followers of Christ, into these bold witnesses that are willing to die for this message. Hallucinations does not even come close to explaining this. It doesn't explain group appearances. People don't experience the same hallucination. Lies, they don't explain the martyrdom of the disciples. And wishful thinking does not explain the empty tomb that was never squashed. Nobody ever said, well, no, they're lying. Here's the body. The only thing that explains it is the resurrection. And that is why the disciples, their sincere belief is one of the strongest historical pillars of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if you get value from this, I hope you did. I appreciate it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back next time with more points. Take care and God bless.